Here from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. By Friday, a lot of American families are going to be packing up the car and the kids and going somewhere to celebrate the holiday, or gathering in the backyard to fire up the barbecue and celebrate the 4th that way. But one father will be marking the day quite differently. For Jim Steinle, Friday marks the 1-year anniversary of the murder of his daughter. It's July 1st, 2015. Jim Steinle was walking on a pier in San Francisco with his daughter, Kate. The gunman opened fire, shot Kate, and she bled to death in her father's arms. Her last words were, "Help me, Dad." As outrageous as this is, one of the aspects that's particularly maddening about this, Mr. President, is that the shooter never should have been on the pier that day. The shooter was an illegal immigrant. He had been convicted of 7 felonies, and he'd been deported 5 times. But what's truly maddening, 3 months prior to his murdering Kate Steinle, he was held in the custody of the San Francisco Police Department. They had him. And when federal immigration officials learned that the San Francisco police had this guy, they asked them to hold him till they could get someone there, because they knew he was here illegally, they knew his background, they knew how dangerous he was, and they wanted to deport him. So what did the San Francisco police do? They refused. They did not cooperate with federal immigration officials. Instead, they released him onto the streets of San Francisco. Now, why, Mr. President, would the San Francisco Police Department do a thing like that? Why in the world would they do a thing like that with a 7-time convicted felon, 5-time deported person that federal immigration officials were asking them to detain? They did it because San Francisco is a sanctuary city. That's what they are. And that means that it is the legal policy of the city of San Francisco to forbid their own police department from even cooperating with federal immigration officials, even when the police would like to. They can't. It's against the law in San Francisco. So think about that. Even when President Obama's administration and the local police are in complete agreement that this person is dangerous, and they want to work together, they want to remove this person from the threat he poses to their community in a sanctuary city, the local politicians override that, and they decide that it will be illegal for the local police to cooperate. And so the San Francisco police, they had no choice. They were forced by their own city government to release the man who would go on to kill Kate Steinle. You know, if federal officials now had called about almost any other kind of crime, if it had been about bank robbery, if it had been about a trademark violation, if it had been about car theft, then it would have been perfectly legal for the San Francisco Police Department to cooperate with the federal authorities. But because this involved an illegal immigrant, the San Francisco Police Department hands were tied. They were forced to release Kate Steinle's eventual killer. Mr. President, as a father of 3 young kids, I can't even imagine what Jim Steinle and his wife have endured and what they're going to go through this Friday. But sadly, the Steinles are not alone. According to an internal Department of Homeland Security memo, during an 8-month period in 2014, sanctuary jurisdictions, cities and counties and towns that have chosen to be sanctuaries, they've released over 8,000 illegal immigrants just during this period in 2014. 1,800 of those released later were arrested for new criminal acts. Included 2 cities that released individuals who'd been arrested for sexual abuse of children. And not surprisingly, these individuals were later arrested yet again for sexually abusing additional children, because that's what these monsters do. Now, let me be clear. This isn't about immigration. This is really not about immigration. The vast majority of immigrants to this country would never commit a heinous violent crime against anybody. But any large group of individuals is going to have some bad actors. And with roughly 11 million people here illegally, among them, there's absolutely violent criminals. It's completely unavoidable. It makes absolutely no sense to insulate those violent criminals from the capture by law enforcement. And I should point out, the dangers posed by these sanctuary city laws are not limited to just domestic crimes, as appalling as they are. Obviously, the sexual abuse of children and murder, that's more than sufficient reason to make sure that we're not conferring a special benefit on these people. But the fact of the matter is, sanctuary cities are impeding our ability to prosecute the war against terrorists. I'll give you a case in point. Last month, President Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Johnson, took a trip to Philadelphia with a modest request, because you see, Philadelphia has a very extreme and radical sanctuary city policy. So President Obama's Homeland Security Secretary went to Philadelphia and he asked Mayor Kenney, the mayor of Philadelphia, to make very narrow exceptions to the sanctuary city policy of Philadelphia. Specifically, he was asking that the Philadelphia Police Department be permitted to cooperate, just sharing information. That's what they were asking for, with the DHS if they were dealing with a suspected terrorist, or someone who had been convicted of a violent felony, or someone who had been convicted of a gang-related offense. Just those cases. Just those. Mayor Kenney refused. The city refused, made no change whatsoever to their sanctuary city status. And so, as we gather this evening, Philadelphia Police Department are absolutely forbidden from cooperating with federal officials unless the federal official can prove that the person in question has already been convicted of a violent felony and they have a warrant for the arrest, which, of course, since the police are not allowed to even communicate with the federal officials, how would they know to seek an arrest warrant? Fact is, Mr. President, this doesn't make any sense. None of this makes any sense. Imagine the Department of Homeland Security calls the Philadelphia Police Department explaining they discover the city has in its custody an illegal immigrant who the FBI suspects is plotting a terrorist attack. And so the Department of Homeland Security asks the Philadelphia police for information about this guy, like when did you pick him up? Did he have other people with him? Who were they? What were they doing? When are you going to release them? There's lots of information they might like, and they might want to say, hold this guy until we can get agents down there in the morning to take him into our custody so that we can interrogate him and begin deportation proceedings. That would be a reasonable conversation, a reasonable request from the Department of Homeland Security. But under the current sanctuary city policy of Philadelphia police have no choice. Their response has to be, and is, come back after the crime's been committed. Come back after he's committed his terrorist offense, and then come back with a warrant, and then we can cooperate with you. Sometimes I wonder, Mr. President, if we have learned anything. After 9/11, after the Boston Marathon bombing, after the San Bernardino murders, and after this horrendous massacre in Orlando, when are we going to start taking this threat seriously? It's here. We see it. We're living through this. Well, in my view, we've lived through too much, way too much. And so I am today continuing my ongoing fight to end these sanctuary cities that endanger all of our communities. I'm introducing the Stop Dangerous Sanctuary Cities Act. It's Senate Bill 3100, and it tackles two problems. So part of the reason that some communities have chosen to be sanctuary cities is in response to court decisions. There are two court decisions that we need to address. One was by the Third Circuit Court of Appeals and the other by a federal district court in Oregon. And these court decisions hold that if the Department of Homeland Security makes a mistake in issuing a detainer, right, in a request to hold someone, turns out Department of Homeland Security made a mistake, maybe they got the wrong guy, And if the local law enforcement cooperates, as I think common sense would suggest we'd like to see, well, according to these court decisions, the local law enforcement, the local police department, would bear a legal liability. They could be sued. They could have who knows what kind of damages. Okay, that's a problem. That's a problem for communities. And in fact, it's driven over a dozen Pennsylvania communities, counties, and municipalities to say, we can't take that legal risk, so we will, quite reluctantly, will become sanctuary cities. Well, there's a simple solution to this. The solution is in my bill. The first thing my bill does is it says that when a local officer is complying with a legitimate, bona fide immigration detainer, duly issued by the Department of Homeland Security, then the local officer has the same authority as a DHS official. A way to think about it is that the local police would be considered agents of the Department of Homeland Security for this purpose. If an individual's rights are violated somehow, the individual would still have every right to sue, but they would not sue the local police department, which was just acting in good faith in cooperation with the Department of Homeland Security. The person would sue the Department of Homeland Security. No diminution of the person's legal rights, their ability to redress anything that went wrongly. It's just the liability ought to attach to DHS, not the local police department. With this change in the law, there would no longer be any pretext or any justification whatsoever for these sanctuary cities and denying the cooperation with federal officials that we need. So the second part of my bill says once that is in place, once we fix that legal liability problem, if a community nevertheless decides they still want to be a sanctuary city, they still want to refuse to cooperate with federal law enforcement, then they'd lose some federal funds. They'd lose some of the funds, some of the CDBG money, Community Development Block Grant funding, which I know every senator is very familiar with how much every city, every municipality that gets this money, how much they want it, because the local politicians get to decide how to spend it. Well, in my view, if you are going to impose the kind of cost on all of us that sanctuary cities impose, the additional cost for federal law enforcement, the additional cost to American people of living in an area where they are going to have greater risks, the just unbelievable and impossible to quantify costs to people like Jim Steinle, who lost his daughter. If you're going to impose those costs, then it's very reasonable for the federal government to choose not to subsidize that. That's what my bill does. It's pretty simple. Frankly, I don't think it should even be controversial. We have leaders across the political spectrum have criticized sanctuary city policy. Former Pennsylvania governor, lifelong Democrat, former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Ed Rendell, has criticized the sanctuary city policy of Philadelphia. President Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security has clearly gone out of his way to try to get Philadelphia to change its misguided policy. Pennsylvania law enforcement officers from across the entire political spectrum, across the entire Commonwealth, they all agree that we've got this right. And last October, the Senate considered a similar measure, and it got bipartisan support, but it didn't have enough to overcome a filibuster. So, Mr. President, I hope now, finally, we're going to fix this. This bill is a simple, common sense bill. I've had this conversation with my constituents, and everyone is just shocked that we haven't already fixed this problem. The bill stands for the simple proposition that the safety of the American people matters, that the life of Kate Steinle matters, that protecting our own homeland from violent criminals, including terrorists, that matters. So as the Steinles observe the tragic anniversary of their daughter's death this Friday, I think they deserve to know that the United States Senate cares about that loss too, and that we're going to do what we can to prevent another senseless and avoidable death from happening again. I yield the floor.